Hello and welcome to this new episode of Velocity Kinetics called Pure Racing Fuel. We are using my name from my old blog for this podcast type episode. In these episodes I'm going to try channeling my inner Simon Whistler. He is the gentleman behind things like mega projects, side projects, casual criminalist. Why am I going to try channeling him as best as I can? Because I like the way he talks and how expressive he is in the way he covers what he wants to cover. I've noticed in some of the episodes I've done that I can occasionally come across a bit monotone, which is not my intent at all. So what are we going to be covering in this very first podcast type episode? We're going to be covering a tribute to Sir Frank Williams. The founder of the Williams Formula One team recently lost his life after a short spell in hospital. It is an event that has shocked and rocked the entire motorsport industry, and we are unlikely to ever see a man like him again in Formula One. He was a man in many ways from a bygone age, but still embodied everything that everyone aspires to be in Formula One, and he was doing this with an incredible handicap of being disabled. He was the world's oldest living tetraplegic after a car accident returning from testing years ago. So, with the way this episode is going to work, for YouTube, well, it's not going out on any podcast platform at the moment, but we will be putting it on YouTube. I'll be using some stock footage where I can, because I'd like the opportunity for this video to be monetized. But here's our tribute to the late, great Sir Francis Williams. So where else do we begin with something like this, other than at the beginning of his life? Francis Owen Garbett Williams, most commonly known as Frank, was born on the 16th of April 1942 in South Shields, a small coastal town in the northeast of England. To be geographically correct, this is in South Tyneside, a traditionally working class area. His father was an active RAF officer, and his mother was a school teacher. Sadly, his parents' marriage wouldn't last, and during its breakdown, he would be raised by an aunt and uncle who lived in the next town over called Jarrow. He spent most of his later childhood at a private boarding school, St Joseph's College in Dumfries, Scotland. Frank had always had a love of cars and speed. In the late 1950s, he was given a ride by a friend in a Jaguar XK150, which confirmed his love of speed. There is footage in the Williams F1 movie of Sir Frank racing, hard and fast. Whilst he had a love of speed, it often caught up to him. In the movie there is footage of quite a major shunt Sir Frank had, demonstrating his need for speed. He also had a passion for long-distance running. At the end of a long day, it wouldn't be unusual for Frank to go out and run miles. After a brief stint as a mechanic, Frank founded Frank Williams Racing Cars in 1966, which was also funded through his work as a travelling grocery salesman. He met Virginia Berry in 1967, and they were married in 1974. Ginny was as much a part of the Williams team as anyone else. However, we will cover a bit more about Ginny in a little bit. As we touched on, Frank loved speed and driving, but was aware he'd reach his own peak as a driver. He would often enter his friend and flatmate Piers Courage into races, running cars in Formula 3 and Formula 2. After Williams backed Courage in a successful Formula 2 season in 1968, Frank purchased a Brabham Formula 1 car for Piers in 1969. Allegedly, this angered Jack Brabham, as it had been sold to Frank on the basis that it would be used in the Tasman series before being converted to Formula 5000. Piers would have a good year in this car, taking second in the Monaco and United States Grand Prix. These efforts were not unnoticed. These results attracted the interest of Italian sports car manufacturer Di Tommaso, who built an F1 chassis designed by Gian Polo Dallara for the 1970 season. Whilst this was during a time when you could buy a Ford Cosworth DFV off the shelf and go racing, if the car wasn't up to scratch, the DFV couldn't make up for it. The 1970 car was uncompetitive and failed to finish the first 4 races of the season. The 5th race was the Dutch Grand Prix. It was here where something would happen to Frank that, by all accounts, would fundamentally change the man. During this Grand Prix, the car flipped and caught fire, killing Piers. This was back at a time when racing cars were engines bolted to the back of a steel tube that was in essence a fuel tank with a steering wheel and a seat. As the two were great friends, the death of Piers really upset Frank. Since then, Frank has always placed distance between himself and his drivers. It is hard enough for one psyche to deal with this once, never mind repeatedly. The team struggled on for the rest of the season with Brian Redman and Tim Schenken. However, as there were no results, the partnership with Di Tommaso was dissolved. For the 1971 season, Frank purchased a year-old March 701 using Frenchman Henri Pescarolo as driver. The team were able to upgrade to the March 711, but much like the previous season, results were hard to come by. After the high of 1969, funds were running low, and Williams was living hand to mouth. These challenging times are things that Frank often was able to dig deep in and find a way of hanging on. Thanks to a 4th place finish in the British Grand Prix and a 6th place in Austria, the team was able to keep going. Just barely. Frank was famously conducting business from a telephone box as his phone had been disconnected because of unpaid bills. 1972 would bring around a change for the team. French oil company Motul came on board as a sponsor, enabling Frank to buy a new March 721 for Pescarolo. There was also backing from Italian toy company Politoys, which provided money for the team to become a proper manufacturer and build an in-house chassis. Called the Politoys FX3, the car made one championship race. Powered by a conventional Cosworth DFV, it debuted at the British Grand Prix in the hands of Pescarolo, but the steering failed and the car was heavily damaged. They reverted to the March 721 for the rest of the season. Such was the damage to the car. The FX3 made one more outing at a non-championship victory race at Brands Hatch in the hands of Chris Amon. However, the car qualified 20th and then retired with an engine failure. At the end of 1972, Politoys and Motul withdrew their funding, but Frank had managed to get backing from tobacco giant Marlboro and Italian sports car manufacturer Iso Ortiviccioli for the 1973 season. The FX3 was reworked into the FX3B, and 2 cars were entered for the season. New Zealand's Howden Ganley and the Italian Nannini Galli were selected as drivers. The car was again uncompetitive, suffering from handling and cooling problems. The crux of the issue was the car was obsolete. However, it managed 4th in the 1973 Race of Champions in the hands of Tony Trimmer. 1974 would be an interesting year on many fronts. Multiple drivers, a handful of points. Money problems are amongst many things the team faced. However, it is most notable for the first time we saw something that is now a legend in the world of F1. The chassis for the cars was given the designation FW for Frank Williams. We saw the FW01, the FW02, and the FW03, even though they were all ostensibly the same car. In 1975, we saw much of the same, in many ways a running theme to Frank. Paid drivers needed to keep the team going, using the previous year's cars whilst the FW04 was being constructed. It was this year Frank made a signing that would again cement his name in F1. He signed a young engineer called Patrick Head. During this season, the team would score their only points in a race of aggression and attrition in Germany, where Jacques Lafitte brought the FW04 home in second place, just behind the Brabham of Carlos Reutemann. This brought more essential money to a team that was on the verge of going under. But it was the 1976 season which saw a major change for Frank. Walter Wolf, an Austro-Canadian oil millionaire, bought a 60% share of Frank Williams racing cars. Whilst the team was no longer his, Frank stayed on as an employee and stayed in position as team manager. Wolf had acquired the Hesketh assets at the same time, and the team used this as their car for the opening race of the season. It was branded the Wolf Williams FW05. Even though it wasn't Frank's team anymore, it still had his name to it. At an end-of-season restructure, Wolf decided to remove Frank from the team. In a situation like this, there are a small number of options available to yourself. Ultimately, it boils down to 2 things. Either you wallow, or you work. And Frank went to work. And work hard. Patrick Head left Wolf at the same time as Frank, and together they acquired an old carpet factory in Didcot, Oxfordshire, and set up what would become a powerhouse of Formula One. Williams Grand Prix Engineering. This was founded in 1977, and the team fielded 1 car that year at 11 races, driven by Patrick Nave, using a March 761 chassis. Whilst the team failed to score a point, they did achieve a best finish of 7th. Patrick Head set about designing the first car for Williams for the 1978 season, the FW06, blazoned in white and the iconic Fly Saudia and Tag green sponsorship. Williams had signed the Australian Alan Jones for their single entry. Whilst initial races were difficult, they scored their first championship points in the 3rd round at South Africa, finishing 4th. They even managed their first podium at the United States Grand Prix. second place. They finished 9th in the constructors with 11 points. It was apparent that the ground effect was becoming the way to go towards with design at the end of 1978, and Frank hired Frank Durney to help Patrick Head with the design. Durney's input would be to design the aerodynamic development and skirt design for the FW07. In 1979, Williams obtained membership to the Formula One Constructors Association, FOCA, which stated the preference for entrants to run 2 cars. Jones was partnered up with Clay Records for the season. It wouldn't be until Monaco, the 7th round of the season that year, for the team to score points. They came close to winning, but Clay finished second, barely 1 second behind the Ferrari of Jody Scheckter. At round 8 in Dijon, whilst it is most famously remembered for the duel for the lead between René Arnoux and Gilles Villeneuve, Frank's team achieved its first double points finish with 4th and 6th. But the biggest breakthrough wouldn't be until Silverstone, where Records scored the team's first win by over 25 seconds. This should have been a 1-2, but due to issues on Jones's car, he had to retire. The first 1-2 would come at the next round at Hockenheim, and another win in Austria made it to 3 wins in a row for the team. One more victory was in the offing at the penultimate race in Montreal. Williams Grand Prix Engineering had achieved more in 3 years than some teams achieve in twice that time. However, there was more to be had for Frank. In 1980 came the first of the championships, with Jones now partner to Carlos Reutemann. They dominated. Jones became the first of 7 Williams drivers to win the Drivers' Championship, and Williams secured their first Constructors' Championship. Such was the level of domination that year that they scored 120 points. Second placed Ligier only had half of that. This success continued in 1981, with the team winning the Constructors' Championship again with 95 points, 34 ahead of second placed Brabham. However, 1982 would prove a little more difficult. Turbocharging was becoming the norm. The huge power outputs of the turbo cars had meant that being quick enough through the corners was no longer a way to catch up. The Ford Cosworth DFV simply was not powerful enough. However, they did still win the championship with Keke Rosberg, despite him only winning 1 race. Rosberg would be one of only 3 drivers to attempt to defend their championship with Williams. Such was the nature of the team. To try and combat this power deficit, Frank looked to Honda for the turbo power. In 1983, Frank, ever the businessman, entered an agreement to use Honda engines for 1984. 1983 and 84 were a mixed bag. Race wins for Rosberg, but the team had slipped down the order of the constructors. However, hope was there. This deal with Honda was the first in the start of an iconic partnership, which also led to some of the most iconic looking racing cars ever. Stories about the Honda partnership are varied and are not widely talked about, at least not as widely as everything else. I remember seeing something with Dickie Stanford, and he said that when they got the Honda engine, it arrived in a box from Japan, with no instructions. They had to endure engines going bang and reliability problems from Honda. However, performances were respectful. 1985 saw the beginning of an iconic team and driver pairing with Nigel Mansell, being partnered to Rosberg. The also iconic Canon colours of blue, yellow and white adorned the cars from this time until 1994. The 1985 FW10 finished 3rd in the Constructors, but 1986 would be a difficult year. But perhaps not in the way we think. In the context of all we have covered so far, you might think we are talking about a bad year for the car. In fact, in 1986, the team came close to winning the Drivers' Championship with Mansell and Piquet. The iconic scenes of Mansell's rear tyre blowing after fighting down the straight with Senna is iconic. The team did win the Constructors this year, but Frank was going to be out of this one for most of a year. As we mentioned, Frank had a love of speed, and everything had a sense of urgency to it. On returning from pre-season testing at Paul Ricard, Frank was driving a rental Ford Sierra extremely fast. He had to make a flight back to the UK, as it was a half marathon the next day he wanted to participate in. As he was winding down the roads with his partner Peter Windsor, then sponsorship manager, the back end of the car started to skip. The car rolled over and landed on its roof. Frank was aware something wasn't right after the accident and was rightly fearful that the car might go up in flames. Peter got Frank clear of the car. During this accident, he suffered a spinal fracture between the 4th and 5th vertebrae. Due to the nature of his injuries, people began to think Frank was going to die. Ginny went to the French hospital with Patrick Head, where Frank was, and arranged urgent repatriation to the Royal London Hospital. It was here they performed a tracheotomy, which allowed them to drain the fluid from Frank's lungs, which no doubt saved his life. During all this, Frank was not in a state to say for himself what was going on. Internally, he did only what Frank knew what to do: fight. to fight and to fight hard. In the Williams movie, there are extracts from an old interview with Ginny Williams, and she mentions she asked nurses to show her how to keep the tracheotomy clear for Frank to keep him alive. She believed that she saved his life countless times as she stayed in the room with him. From what I have read and watched over the years myself as a fan of the Williams team, I would say it is almost certain Frank owed his survival more to Ginny than the medical staff, not to undermine the excellent treatment he would have undoubtedly received from the doctors and nurses. Anyone who has had a family member who has been extremely independent will know how difficult it can be for someone to rescind their independence when something happens. This could be simply from a bad head cold or stroke flu, all the way up to an injury. I know myself when my father suffered his back injury, it was an extremely difficult adjustment for him to make. Going from working and being very independent, it's been difficult to such a degree that I think over 20 years later, he still hasn't made the adjustment. However, my father could appreciate the times when he needed to slow down and take a breather. Frank did not. He would be absent from family vacations, he was away and had to do something with the team. Unlike my father's back injury, which restricted his mobility, Frank's injury took away all his mobility. A man who would routinely run half marathons without too much bother, or swapping his running shoes for a wheelchair. Whilst I have not read Ginny Williams' autobiography, called A Different Kind of Life, which was published in 1991, I can guess how Frank was behind closed doors initially. This accident rendered Frank a tetraplegic. This is a paralysis often caused by injury or illness that results in partial or total loss of sensation in all limbs. Frank fought hard enough to be able to regain a little use in his arms. He managed to be able to move himself in such a way where he could push himself along in his wheelchair. He had a special phone made for his office where he could punch in numbers himself to conduct business. During this time, there is a wonderful picture of Ginny on the podium accepting the manufacturer's trophy, and I believe it was Silverstone, 1986. It was such a look of defiance on her face, defiant that Frank has beaten the odds to be there, but it's an immensely glorious image, and one you can't help but react to. Frank was able to come back in 1987, which was the year the Honda partnership bore fruit with the Drivers' Championship for PK, and the constructors for the team as well. It would be the last year of the Honda partnership, but a terrific way to sign off. Away from the track, Frank was awarded a CBE, Command of the British Empire, by the Queen. His team were going to run into trouble from 1988, as they had to switch to the non-turbo Judd engine for that year. However, for 1989, their most iconic engine partnership was to begin, the tie-in with Renault. This is a partnership that would last until 1997 as an official works engine, and up to 1999 with rebranded engines. It was within this period with Renault that Williams began to dominate again. They would produce some of the most technologically advanced cars F1 has ever seen in the form of the FW14B and the FW15C. Active suspension, traction control, and anti-lock brakes, to name a few things that they pioneered. They won 3 Constructors' Championships 3 years in a row, between 1992 and 1994, and had some of the biggest names you can sign. Mansell becoming champion in 92, and that was a long overdue championship for their partnership. Prost, coming in 1993, was a major move, but it did cost them a chance at signing Senna. However, a French driver powered by a French engine made fantastic marketing sense. Then 1994 came. They secured Ayrton Senna to drive along Damon Hill. The FW16 was a bit of a difficult car to drive, but they were getting on top of it. Then Imola came. Almost certainly the darkest weekend motorsport had seen for years. The infamous Tamboreno Corner, where Senna lost control and sped off into the barriers. There are many theories about what happened, but as it was an unnatural death, the Italian legal system impounded the car and investigated the incident. They were wanting to charge Frank Williams, Patrick Head, and Adrian Newey with manslaughter. They were acquitted in 1997, however part of the incident kept going until 2005, most notably getting the car back. Frank has always been quiet about what happened and wouldn't really speak about it, but I remember watching a VT on the BBC when they had the broadcasting rights, and Frank said he felt guilty, even now about it, because Senna died in a car bearing the Williams name. Drivers' titles came for Hill in 1996 and Villeneuve in 1997, and since then everything's been exceedingly difficult for the team. 1998 and 1999 they had rebranded Renault engines before partnering with BMW. The BMW partnership was the closest to glory the team had been able to get since the Renault days. The BMW engines were strong, light, powerful, and on many occasions the only thing that could take it to the all-conquering Ferrari. but they're also fragile. Initially, the engines blew up at an astounding rate. Reliability came, but they couldn't put all the parts together to create a good enough chassis. The driver lineup of Ralf Schumacher and Juan Pablo Montoya was as strong of a lineup as Frank had mustered at any time. But in 2005, the relationship with BMW broke down and left Williams without an engine. Some say it was Frank's unwillingness to part with any equity and become a full works effort that stopped everything going the way it should. We can't really comment, but Frank could certainly be as bull-headed as they come. This stubbornness didn't mean he had no business acumen, though. Quite the opposite. In 1999, Frank was knighted, and most of the time just simply referred to as Sir Frank, much like you would refer to Jackie Stewart as Sir Jackie. And quite rightly so. After the BMW split, Williams sought to tie up with Cosworth for engines again. Sadly, they spent most of their time blowing up. The switch to Cosworth in 2006 led to a season where it was the first time since entering in 1977 without a single podium. The switch to Toyota engines in 2007 led to a bit more success for the team, with Nico Rosberg scoring 2 podiums in 2008. The rule changes for 2009 were as good a chance as any for Williams to get back up to the top. They were one of 3 teams with a double diffuser, but didn't monopolise on it as well as Brawn had. A switch back to Cosworth for 2010 saw the team bag the first pole position for a Cosworth-powered car since 1998 when a Stuart Ford had achieved this. This came in Brazil in the hands of Hulkenberg and was thought to be news of what was to come. Unfortunately, and not for the first time, Williams found themselves in financial difficulty and had to dismiss Hulkenberg in favour of the moneyed Pastor Maldonado, with his sponsorship from the Venezuelan oil company PDVSA, which had allowed the team to spend on infrastructure, etc. But 2011 yielded the team's worst result to that date. Whilst Barrichello posted the fastest time in pre-season testing, that's all it was. Hope came when they changed the rules about exhaust blowing the diffuser at Silverstone before a rapid reversal that same weekend, and made a mess of those chances. Another engine switch later for 2012, they were back with Renault, with more commercial backing from Bruno Senna in the second Williams seat. The team won for the first time since the BMW days. They won the 2012 Barcelona Grand Prix before their garage went up in flames. Whilst Williams have come awfully close in the last few years to a win, their last win was in 2012. For a team with this pedigree, it's absolutely terrible. It certainly seemed to take its toll on Sir Frank. It cannot have been easy. Coupled to this during this time, Ginny was battling with cancer, which will also take its toll on Frank, and she ultimately lost that battle in March 2013. Losing Ginny might well sum up the year they had in 2013. The FW35 was a terrible car, even worse than the FW33. But hope was around the corner. In 2014, rule changes with turbo engines and a fantastic partnership with Mercedes-Benz was a light of hope. They're the only team to stop an all-Mercedes Works front row lockout. The team secured their first front row lockout in Austria 2014, and that was their first since the German Grand Prix in 2003. But since then, the team has slipped back gradually, culminating in easily the worst F1 car they've ever produced, the FW42. It had baiting chassis problems, turned up late to testing, and scored 1 solitary point on a technicality all year. In some ways, Frank showed his fortitude during these times. He kept going and fighting on. But more days of sleeping at the factory for him, which was not uncommon since Ginny passed away, and the constant struggle of being at the back took its toll. Williams is not there to make up the numbers. They are there to do one thing, and one thing only: to win. The team was acquired by Dorilton Capital in August 2020, and at the Italian Grand Prix in 2020, it was the last time the team raced under family ownership. Since then, the Williams family have been quiet. I hope Sir Frank had time to spend with his grandchildren. I remember a scene from the Williams movie where Sir Frank apparently decided one day to go to the zoo with his carer, as he'd never seen a tiger. Didn't think to ask if his grandson wanted to go or if the family wanted to go. He just went. It sums up the man, really. Impulsive for the right things. Apparently they went again and his grandson sat on his lap the whole time when they were watching the tigers. This isn't the side that's often talked about when it comes to Sir Frank. We usually see the stern-faced racer and heard what we needed to hear in the press. But nothing about him. Ginny seemed to keep him level when she was alive. However, in the tapes for her book, she reckoned there had probably been other women along the way to service in need. Not something we want to go into any further here, and it is wrong for us to comment and speculate. But as was Sir Frank's focus when it came to his wedding day with Ginny, he turned up at the registry office and then went back to work afterwards. I know my wife wouldn't have let me do that. He was a man who was so passionate, maybe to a fault or severe fault. But the faults make the man, and behind every man is a strong partner keeping them in check. I know this from my wife Sarah. I think without her I wouldn't be in check as much as I am. Similarly, I don't think Frank would have been in check as much without Ginny. Certainly, as we've covered, Frank would most likely not be here without her. With a condition like Sir Frank had, life expectancy isn't long. I believe at one point he was given 10 years. He has well and truly surpassed that. He was the world's oldest living tetraplegic, and a brilliant example of not letting a disability hold you back. Besides being a CBE and knighted, he was also one of the few non-Frenchmen to be given the Chevalier of France's Légion d'Honneur, accorded for his work with Renault engines. In 2008, Frank was awarded the Wheatcroft Trophy for his contribution to motorsport. On the 19th of December 2010, he was awarded the Helen Rawson Award for Outstanding Achievement in the Face of Adversity at the BBC Sports Personality of the Year Awards. There have been times over the years where it's looked touch and go for Frank, with various illnesses and infections. My wife has told me that this isn't uncommon with his condition, and it's certainly not uncommon with age. Sir Frank was admitted to hospital for the last time on the 26th of November 2021, and he died peacefully on the morning of the 28th of December 2021, aged 79. I've been finding it hard to manage my emotions when it comes to Sir Frank, as he is in many ways a hero to me. I have done blogs over on the original Pure Racing Fuel WordPress blog, and in the early Velocity Kinetics days about Williams, lamenting about what they should do. None of this really matters. Sir Frank was an amazing human being who fought on in the face of adversity. It is something to be respected. I'm reminded of a Queen song that they released in 1998 when they paid tribute to Freddie Mercury in their song No One But You. It's part of the last verse. It's, and now the party must be over. I guess we'll never understand. The sense of your leaving was in the way it was planned. It feels so wrong we lost Frank in this way. But there is a crumb of comfort for me that it wasn't COVID. It wasn't any more suffering than he may have already been through. We will miss you, Sir Frank. We at Velocity Kinetics are very saddened by your loss. We hope your family are coping as best as they can. More importantly, Sir Frank, rest in peace. And for everything you've done for F1, we really mean that last part. Rest.